problem, officer?
You're driving a stolen vehicle. Step out now.
Officer, I'm a federal agent. Let me show you my identification.
Federal agent? In street clothes?
I'm undercover DEA. This car is registered to me personally.
Save the story for booking.
Really?
You're under arrest for grand theft auto. You're making a career-ending mistake. The only mistake here is yours, thinking you could steal this car.
Agent Daniel Jones was finishing a 3-month undercover operation targeting a drug trafficking ring when Officer Brandon Sullivan pulled him over for driving while black in an expensive neighborhood. What started as routine racial profiling became a federal incident when Sullivan refused to verify Jones's credentials and arrested him for stealing his own Mercedes. The body cam footage would go viral, end Sullivan's career, and prove that even federal law enforcement isn't immune to being profiled. Quick check before we move on. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop it below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time to do it so you don't miss the next part. We cover stories you won't see in mainstream media. By subscribing, you ensure these stories finally get heard. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in Atlanta's affluent Buckhead neighborhood. Daniel had just finished meeting with a confidential informant, a dangerous encounter that had taken place in a parking garage downtown. His Mercedes wasn't just transportation, it was part of his cover. Drug dealers expected their business partners to drive expensive cars. The DEA had authorized the purchase specifically for this operation. Sullivan had been patrolling the area for 2 hours when he spotted the black Mercedes with tinted windows. In his mind, the equation was simple. Expensive car plus black driver in Buckhead equaled probable theft. He'd made this assumption dozens of times before over his 8-year career, and it had never cost him anything more than a complaint he could easily dismiss. Daniel watched in his rearview mirror as Sullivan approached. Already knowing how this would go, he'd heard the stories from other black agents, other black professionals. The moment Sullivan saw him, the officer's expression shifted from routine caution to aggressive suspicion. License and registration, Sullivan demanded, his flashlight deliberately shining into Daniel's eyes. Officer, before I reach for anything, I need you to know I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in my wallet along with my license. But Sullivan had already decided what he was looking at. Keep your hands where I can see them. This vehicle was reported stolen 2 hours ago. Daniel's mind raced. No Mercedes matching his description had been reported stolen. Sullivan was lying, or at best, making assumptions. Officer, I can prove ownership. The registration is in my glove compartment. My name is on the title. Anyone can forge documents. Step out of the vehicle. This was the moment that would define both their futures. Daniel had 2 choices. Comply with an unlawful order from a biased officer, or assert his rights as a federal agent and risk escalation. He chose truth. Officer, my name is Agent Daniel Jones, DEA, badge number 2847. I'm currently assigned to the Atlanta field office conducting an authorized undercover operation. This vehicle is registered to me personally, purchased with DEA approval for operational security. I need you to verify my credentials before this situation goes any further. Sullivan's response would destroy his career. I don't care if you say you're the president, you're under arrest. Officer Brandon Sullivan had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 8 years, and those 8 years told a story that his supervisors had chosen to ignore. 14 complaints. 14 separate incidents where citizens had accused him of racial profiling, excessive force, or unlawful detention. 13 of those complaints involved black drivers in affluent neighborhoods where Sullivan believed they didn't belong. A black businessman stopped outside his own office building in Midtown. Sullivan had detained him for 40 minutes, convinced the man was planning a break-in. The businessman owned the building. Complaint filed, resolved with diversity training. A black family pulled over after leaving a Buckhead restaurant. Sullivan searched their vehicle for drugs, finding nothing because there was nothing to find. The father was a Morehouse College professor taking his children to dinner. Complaint filed. Closed with implicit bias workshop requirement. A black woman questioned for 20 minutes while picking up her children from private school. Sullivan assumed she was a domestic worker who didn't belong in the carpool line. She was a federal judge. Complaint filed. Dismissed after Sullivan completed community relations seminar. The pattern was undeniable, documented, and ignored. Sullivan's supervisors noted in his evaluations that he was proactive in high crime prevention and diligent about property protection. They never mentioned that his definition of high crime prevention seemed to focus exclusively on black people existing in spaces he thought they couldn't afford. Internal Affairs had a thick file on Sullivan. 14 complaints over 8 years meant he was generating nearly 2 complaints per year, far above the department average. But Atlanta PD was understaffed, facing a recruitment crisis. And Sullivan technically hadn't been convicted of anything criminal. So he stayed on patrol, his biases unchecked, his pattern unbroken. That Tuesday night, Sullivan was working his regular Buckhead beat when he spotted Daniel's Mercedes. In his mind, the calculation was automatic. Black driver plus expensive car plus affluent neighborhood equals stolen vehicle. He'd made this assumption so many times that he no longer questioned whether it might be wrong. Agent Daniel Jones represented everything Sullivan couldn't accept. A black man who belonged in spaces Sullivan thought should be reserved for white people. A black man who could afford luxury cars through legitimate success. A black man whose authority exceeded Sullivan's own. Daniel had earned his place through 12 years of exemplary federal service. He'd graduated from Georgia State University with a degree in criminal justice, then spent 2 years as a local police officer before being recruited by the DEA. His federal career had taken him across the country and around the world. He'd infiltrated drug cartels in Mexico, dismantled money laundering operations in Miami, and testified before Congress about drug trafficking patterns. The Mercedes that Sullivan assumed was stolen had been purchased 18 months earlier with DEA approval. Undercover operations require agents to blend into criminal environments, and drug dealers expected their partners to display wealth. The car wasn't just Daniel's personal vehicle, it was a crucial piece of federal law enforcement equipment. Daniel had grown up in Atlanta's Vine City neighborhood, watching his single mother work 2 jobs to keep their family housed and fed. He'd seen what drugs did to communities, how addiction destroyed families, how trafficking organizations preyed on desperation. Becoming a DEA agent wasn't just a career choice, it was a mission. The current operation had consumed 3 months of his life. He'd spent weeks building relationships with mid-level dealers, slowly working his way up the trafficking hierarchy. Tonight's meeting with his confidential informant had provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down a network moving cocaine from Colombia through Atlanta to cities across the Southeast. Dozens of arrests were planned for the following week. Sullivan knew none of this. He saw a black man in an expensive car and made the only calculation his biased mind could process: theft. Daniel's neighborhood wasn't far from where Sullivan had pulled him over. He'd chosen to live in Buckhead specifically because it was close to the DEA field office, because the commute was manageable, and because he'd earned the right to live anywhere he could afford. He'd been profiled in this same neighborhood before, by security guards, by store clerks, by neighbors who couldn't imagine a black man legitimately belonging in their affluent enclave. But he'd never been profiled by a police officer while driving home from a federal operation. He'd never had his credentials dismissed as fake by someone sworn to uphold the law. He'd never experienced the particular humiliation of being arrested for possessing his own property. Sullivan's decision to ignore Daniel's federal credentials and proceed with an unlawful arrest would trigger a chain of events that would expose 8 years of documented racial profiling, cost the city $5.1 million, and end multiple careers. But in that moment, Sullivan was convinced he was making the arrest of his career. Sullivan's radio crackled as he reached for his handcuffs. Dispatch. I need backup at the intersection of Peachtree and Lenox. I have a stolen vehicle recovery in progress. Suspect is being uncooperative. Daniel's hands remained visible on his steering wheel. Officer Sullivan, I'm not being uncooperative. I'm trying to prevent you from making a federal case out of racial profiling. Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you myself. Daniel complied slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd been trained in de-escalation, but Sullivan seemed determined to escalate regardless of evidence. Officer, my DEA credentials are in my wallet. My badge number is 2847. You can verify my identity with one phone call. Sullivan grabbed Daniel's arm roughly. Anyone can buy fake federal credentials online. Turn around. Then call the DEA field office. Call Atlanta PD's federal liaison. Call anyone who can verify that you're about to arrest a federal agent for driving his own car. But Sullivan's mind was made up. He'd seen black men in expensive cars claim to be doctors, lawyers, business owners. In his experience, they were all lying, all trying to talk their way out of legitimate arrests. The fact that Daniel's story was more elaborate just meant he was a more sophisticated criminal. The handcuffs clicked shut around Daniel's wrists, deliberately tight. Sullivan had perfected this technique over 8 years, using pain compliance to discourage resistance. You're under arrest for grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, and impersonating a federal officer. Impersonating a federal officer? My credentials are real. My badge is real. This car is registered in my name. A second patrol car arrived within 3 minutes. Officer Damian Brooks stepped out, immediately assessing the scene. Black man in handcuffs, expensive car, Sullivan looking pleased with himself. Brooks had worked with Sullivan before and recognized the pattern. What do we have, Sullivan? Stolen Mercedes. Suspect had fake DEA credentials, claimed to be undercover, real professional operation. Daniel turned toward Brooks, his voice controlled but urgent. Officer Brooks, I'm Agent Daniel Jones, DEA. I live 6 blocks from here. This is my personally owned vehicle, purchased with federal approval for undercover operations. Officer Sullivan arrested me without verifying my credentials. Brooks examined the credentials Sullivan had confiscated. The badge looked authentic, the photo matched, the identification card had proper security features. Sullivan, these look real to me. Anyone can fake documents these days. Look at him. Does he look like a DEA agent? And there it was. The statement that would be played in courtrooms, in news reports, in training seminars about racial profiling. Sullivan's bias laid bare for everyone to hear. A small crowd had gathered. Buckhead residents walking their dogs, couples leaving restaurants, people who'd heard the commotion and pulled out their phones. Multiple cameras were now recording, capturing Sullivan's refusal to verify legitimate credentials and Brooks's growing discomfort with the situation. Sullivan, maybe we should call the DEA. Verify his identity before we transport. I'm not calling anyone. This is stolen vehicle recovery, and I'm not letting some con artist talk his way out of it. Daniel could see Brooks wavering, torn between backing his partner and recognizing obvious evidence. Officer Brooks, my supervisor is Special Agent in Charge, Patricia Williams. The Atlanta field office number is 404-679-9000. Ask for SAC Williams and tell her Agent Jones has been detained. She'll verify my identity and current operational status. Sullivan's radio squawked again. Unit 47, what's your status on that vehicle recovery? In custody, 1 suspect, transporting to downtown booking. Officer Sullivan, Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of 12 years federal service, you are making a career-ending mistake. When my identity is verified, when the body cam footage is reviewed, when this incident is investigated, your pattern of racial profiling will finally face consequences. But Sullivan was beyond listening. He'd convinced himself this was the arrest that would define his career, the big bust that would earn him recognition. He couldn't see that it was indeed career-defining, just not in the way he imagined. A black SUV pulled up across the street. The driver, an elderly white man, rolled down his window. Officers, is everything all right? I live in this neighborhood, and I've seen that man before. He drives that Mercedes regularly. Sullivan ignored the witness. Brooks looked increasingly uncomfortable. The crowd was growing larger, phones recording everything. Daniel remained calm, knowing that every second of Sullivan's refusal to verify his credentials was being documented. Transport him downtown, Sullivan ordered. We'll sort this out at the station. They were about to transport a federal agent to booking for driving his own car home from a federal operation. The body cam footage would capture every moment of Sullivan's biased decision-making, Brooks's hesitation, and Daniel's professional composure under unlawful arrest. Sergeant Nina Alvarez's voice came over the radio. Units 47 and 52, I'm responding to your location for supervisor verification. The supervisor who would confirm Daniel's credentials was 3 minutes away, but Sullivan was determined to complete his arrest before anyone could contradict his assumptions. By midnight, the body cam footage had exploded across social media. DEA agent arrested for driving his own Mercedes. Atlanta cop refuses to verify federal credentials. Racial profiling caught on camera. The videos were being shared thousands of times per hour. and the outrage was building exponentially. Captain Leonard Price was awakened at 1:47 a.m. by a call from the chief of police. The footage was everywhere. News stations were running the story. Federal officials were demanding explanations. A DEA agent had been unlawfully arrested by one of Price's officers, and the entire incident was documented in humiliating detail. Price arrived at headquarters to find Daniel Jones waiting with his attorney and a representative from the DEA's Office of Inspector General. This wasn't just a local incident anymore. It was a federal case with federal implications. "Captain Price," Daniel said, his voice controlled but firm. "Officer Sullivan had 14 prior complaints for racial profiling. 14. Your department's failure to discipline him enabled tonight's violation of my civil rights." The internal affairs file on Sullivan told the story Price had been dreading to confront. 14 complaints over 8 years. A clear pattern of targeting black drivers in affluent areas. Training requirements that were completed but never enforced. Supervisors who noted concerns but took no action. Sullivan was suspended within 24 hours. His badge and service weapon were confiscated. His access to department facilities was revoked, but the damage was already done. The bodycam footage showed everything. His assumptions, his bias, his refusal to verify legitimate credentials. The federal investigation began immediately. The DEA's Office of Inspector General, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Section all launched parallel investigations. When federal agents are unlawfully arrested, the response is swift and comprehensive. Daniel filed a federal civil rights lawsuit 6 weeks later. The complaint named Sullivan, Brooks, Captain Price for supervisory failure, and the Atlanta Police Department for deliberate indifference to Sullivan's pattern of racial profiling. The evidence was overwhelming. Body cam footage from multiple angles, cell phone videos from 20 witnesses, Sullivan's 14 complaint history, documented proof of Daniel's legitimate ownership of the Mercedes, federal verification of his credentials and operational status. Atlanta city attorneys reviewed the case and reached an inevitable conclusion: indefensible. They recommended immediate settlement negotiations. The lawsuit detailed Sullivan's 8-year pattern: the businessman outside his own building, the professor taking his family to dinner, the federal judge in the school pickup line. Each incident followed the same script: black person in affluent area. Sullivan's assumption of criminality, complaints filed, training assigned, no real consequences. Until Daniel Jones. The settlement came 18 months later, $5.1 million, the largest wrongful arrest settlement in Georgia history, the largest civil rights payout in Atlanta's history, a number so significant that it forced systemic change. Sullivan was terminated 9 months after the arrest. The termination letter was comprehensive and final. Officer Sullivan engaged in racial profiling of a federal agent, refused to verify legitimate credentials, and arrested Agent Jones without probable cause. His documented pattern of similar conduct over 8 years demonstrates unfitness for law enforcement. Brooks received a 30-day suspension for failing to insist on credential verification. Captain Price was demoted for supervisory failure. The entire chain of command that had enabled Sullivan's pattern faced consequences. The reforms came swiftly. Mandatory verification of all federal credentials before arrest. Automatic termination for officers with 3 sustained profiling complaints. Real-time body cam review for all traffic stops in affluent areas. Federal oversight of the department's traffic stop data. Daniel testified before the Atlanta City Council 6 months later. "I'm a federal agent with 12 years of experience investigating the worst criminals in our society. I've infiltrated drug cartels, testified before Congress, and risked my life for public safety. And Officer Sullivan arrested me for driving home from work while black." As he paused, letting the words sink in. The $5.1 million settlement isn't just compensation for my humiliation. It's a message that racial profiling has consequences. That badges don't protect officers who violate civil rights. That departments that ignore patterns of bias will face federal accountability. The room was silent. If this can happen to me, a federal agent with credentials and authority, imagine what happens to black citizens who don't have badges, who don't have federal backing, who don't have resources to fight back. Sullivan's 14 complaints represent 14 victims whose stories never made headlines. Daniel's voice strengthened. Change doesn't come from training seminars or diversity workshops. Change comes from consequences. Real consequences. Career-ending consequences. And today, those consequences are finally real. Sullivan's law enforcement career ended permanently. His name entered the national database of decertified officers. He couldn't work in law enforcement anywhere in America. The bodycam footage became a training video used in police academies across the country, a perfect example of how racial bias destroys careers and costs taxpayers millions. And if you believe that documenting moments like these matters, hit that subscribe button. We're going to keep breaking down what happens when bias meets accountability. We're going to keep exposing the patterns that departments ignore until federal agents get arrested. We're going to keep standing with people who deserve to drive their own cars without being criminalized. This isn't just about one traffic stop or one lawsuit. It's about the change that comes when consequences finally match actions. Sergeant Nina Alvarez arrived as Sullivan was preparing to put Daniel in the patrol car. A 15-year veteran, Alvarez had supervised Sullivan before and knew his tendencies. She stepped out of her supervisor vehicle and immediately noticed the tension between Brooks and Sullivan. "What's the situation here?" Sullivan straightened up, confident in his arrest. "Stolen vehicle recovery, Sergeant. Suspect had fake federal credentials, claimed to be DEA, professional operation." Alvarez looked at Daniel, still in handcuffs, then at the Mercedes, then at the credentials Sullivan had confiscated. Something didn't add up. "Let me see those credentials." She examined them carefully. The badge was heavy, official weight. The photo matched. The identification card had proper Department of Justice seals, correct fonts, appropriate security features. In 15 years, she'd seen plenty of fake badges. These weren't fake. "Sullivan, these look legitimate to me." "Sarge, anyone can make fake documents these days." Alvarez pulled out her phone. "Then, let's verify them." She dialed the DEA Atlanta field office. It was after hours, but federal agencies maintain 24-hour verification lines for law enforcement. "This is Sergeant Alvarez, Atlanta PD. I need to verify the identity of an agent. Badge number 2847, Agent Daniel Jones." Daniel watched Sullivan's face as Alvarez waited for confirmation. For the first time, doubt crept into Sullivan's expression. "Yes, I'll hold." The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Witnesses continued recording. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Daniel remained calm, knowing vindication was seconds away. "I see. 12-year veteran. Currently assigned to undercover operations. Thank you." Alvarez hung up and turned to Sullivan, her voice cold with controlled fury. "Agent Jones is active duty DEA, currently assigned to a federal narcotics investigation. You just arrested a federal agent for driving his own car." Sullivan's face went pale. "But," the report said. "What report?" "You saw a black man in an expensive car and assumed he was a criminal. You ignored his credentials. You refused to verify his identity. You arrested a federal agent based on racial profiling." Alvarez unlocked Daniel's handcuffs herself. "Agent Jones, I apologize on behalf of the Atlanta Police Department. This should never have happened." Daniel rubbed his wrists, red marks visible where the cuffs had been deliberately tightened. "Sergeant, I need copies of all body cam footage from this incident. I need the names and badge numbers of all officers involved, and I need to speak with your captain immediately." Brooks stepped forward. "Agent Jones, I tried to get Sullivan to verify your credentials." "Officer Brooks, you tried, but you didn't insist. You let your partner arrest a federal agent when the evidence of my legitimacy was overwhelming." Sullivan's radio crackled. Dispatch was asking for an update on the stolen vehicle recovery. Alvarez took the radio. "Dispatch, disregard the stolen vehicle call. No crime occurred. Suspect was the legitimate owner." The crowd of witnesses had grown to more than 20 people. Multiple cell phone videos were already uploading to social media. The bodycam footage showed everything. Sullivan's bias, his refusal to verify credentials, his arrest of a federal agent. Within hours, the videos would go viral. "Atlanta cop arrests DEA agent for driving his own Mercedes." The hashtags would trend. The outrage would be immediate and justified. Daniel looked at Sullivan, whose career had just ended in a Buckhead intersection. Officer Sullivan, you had multiple opportunities to verify my credentials. You chose bias over evidence. You chose assumptions over investigation. That choice will define the rest of your career. Sullivan stood silent, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He'd arrested a federal agent, on camera, with witnesses. His 8-year pattern of racial profiling had finally caught up with consequences he couldn't escape.